This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen here in just a second, and you will see the PowerPoint come up. We will email you the PowerPoint right after this in our follow-up email to you. So you will see that. So everybody should be seeing the PowerPoint at this time. So we want to welcome you. I'm Melissa Petrangeloskaya, and I'm the Director of International Training here at Global Rights for Women. So we are very excited to have you here with us. And so as people start to log in, if you could shut off your webcam, that would be great. And then shut off your mic. Sometimes it moves the PowerPoint when people turn on their webcam. So you'll see that happen, unfortunately, every once in a while. And we'll try and correct that as soon as we can. And so we're glad to have you here. We are all in this extraordinary circumstance with all of you of, we're using the term COVID-19 or coronavirus as a global pandemic, and we're trying to adjust and shift what happens and how we can still provide protection to address violence against women. We wanted to start by having panelists who we could kind of just, who we knew well, we could see if they could come on real quick. All the representatives here on this are from Minnesota. I want to just say that. We are Global Rights for Women and have a global reach. Natia, who was one of our representatives from International, wasn't able to be with us, it appears, but we're going to have another webinar next week with more of our international presenters. So just know that. We've also been doing a series of webinars about how to adjust perpetrator programs for domestic violence during this time. Scott and I will be on one together on May 1st, so that will be happening as well. So if you could, please keep your microphones muted, your webcam off. You can type questions into the chat box throughout the presentation. Nazifa and I will share questions and pose those from the comments and questions from the chat box so that the presenters don't have to keep track of that. Nazifa and I will watch for that. And a recording of this will be sent to you afterwards. So Nazifa and I are going to shut off our webcams now, and we're going to have Cheryl start with introducing Global Rights for Women and our presenters. Cheryl?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Melissa and Nazifa. As I said before, I'm so grateful for all your work in getting this webinar series launched here so quickly with the great need that we have nationally and globally. As I said, Cheryl Thomas, I'm the Executive Director of Global Rights for Women, and we are an organization that works here from Minneapolis with leaders around the world to advance women and girls' human right to live free from violence through legal reform and social and systemic change. So for just a little background on me, I have been working in the international global women's human rights movement since 1993, believe it or not, way back before the United Nations said women's rights are human rights and violence against women is a human rights violation. So I'm thrilled that the internet that powered that global women's rights movement and violence against women movement across borders back then is what's going to sustain many of us now, both here nationally and locally when we can't even go across the street for a meeting, but it will connect us too with our partners around the world who are all learning lessons about how to adapt our legal system's response during this crisis. As Melissa said, we've had a webinar with a partner from wonderful partner from Italy in the last couple of weeks, where they've been shut down completely for a long time, and she has just shared with us wonderful lessons learned about how to do better programs when complete shutdown. So we're going to learn from each other. I think that is the most important thing that we can do is stay connected. Stay in solidarity and keep committed to women's human right to live free from violence. So one thing I want to say before I introduce the panelists is that Melissa talked a little bit about our webinar series. Already, we've had just hundreds and hundreds of people join, and we are very committed to listening to the questions and needs, and then shaping further webinars around those needs. So we've already done that, for example, with Batter's intervention program, strategies to use during the COVID time. And we will be doing that absolutely as a result of this webinar today. We will be shaping our future content based on what we hear people's needs are. So why don't we go, we have so much to talk about that I want to go and introduce our panelists right now. Lori, will you introduce yourself, please, and talk a little bit about your experience?
Good morning. My name is Lori Flohaug, and I am an attorney in northern Minnesota. And I have previously worked as a prosecutor primarily in the areas of domestic and sexual violence cases. And I'm currently working as a family law attorney and criminal defense attorney in private practice. As well, I also worked for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in northern Minnesota as a tribal judge, and in that capacity worked on child protection cases. So thank you for allowing me to participate this morning.
Thank you, Lori, for joining us. Your experience is so deep and broad, and Lori has traveled with us around the world to work on systemic and legal reform with partners, and great to have you. Do we have Natia from the Republic of Georgia this morning, Melissa, or not? Natia, are you there? Okay. We hope that Natia, since she can't join us this morning, she is the Deputy Prosecutor General from the Republic of Georgia, who we've worked on on a lot of systemic legal reform changes, and able to join us next week when we do our second court response webinar on Thursday. Scott, please introduce yourself. We're so grateful to have you here with us. Scott Miller.
My name is Scott Miller. I'm Executive Director of the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs in Duluth, Minnesota. Our agency, responsibility really is to coordinate responses in communities around domestic violence, reforming the way the government responds to these particular cases. We also do men's nonviolence program, we do women's nonviolence program, we do education groups for women who've been victims. We have a visitation center, and then we have a national training project where we train people on the responses that we have developed over the years in Duluth, Minnesota.
Thank you, Scott. Really grateful for your deep experience to share with us today. And Erin Osborne from Hennepin County here in Minneapolis. Can you introduce yourself too, Erin? Can everybody hear Erin? I can't.
I don't think Erin can hear you.
Okay. Give Erin one more. Why don't we do this while maybe we can figure that out while we go to John Schulte from up in Duluth, referee John Schulte, who presides over protective orders there. Will you introduce yourself, please, John?
I will, thank you. My name is John Schulte. I'm a judge in Duluth, Minnesota, city in northern Minnesota of about 100,000 people. As a judicial referee, one of my primary duties is I preside over virtually all of the civil domestic abuse order for protection and harassment restraining order matters here in Duluth. Before that, I was in private practice for about 15 years, family law, mediation, and I also worked part-time as a guardian ad litem. So I've been kind of in this arena now for the past 20 years, and it's obviously very challenging work, but also very rewarding work. And I look forward to sharing whatever insights I can.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for taking the time, John. to share your experience. So we're going to go back to Erin. Melissa, are you able to hear Erin from your end? Erin Osborne, you there?
I'm on, Cheryl. I don't hear Erin yet.
Okay. Well, when Erin, if you can hear us, when you jump back in, send us a note on chat or send Melissa a note, and we'll make sure that we incorporate your introduction and experience too. Erin Osborne works in our domestic abuse service center here in Minneapolis and in liaison with anyway, she's working to adapt their practices in helping victims of violence who are seeking emergency or long-term orders for protection get them to the courts. So they are working hard to figure out how to do that in these changed times. Okay, so let's go to the second slide since we can't hear Erin yet. The next slide. So I was just going to introduce the topic here with a couple of slides that I think provide context for the time that we are in. And I just meant to say this earlier, and I will say it now. I hope you and your families are all safe and healthy. We are in a time right now in this country and in this world that is unprecedented, and we are all struggling with new challenges every single day as the landscape changes by the hour and minute. I believe in that context that the government interventions and the community interventions that challenge the centuries-old notion that violence against women and girls is a private matter, even in these times, must proceed. We can't go back to those times when women had to live and their children had to live alone and in danger, and our legal systems dismissed the assaults that they lived with as something that was not their responsibility. Women's access to safety will depend on, just really the same things in many ways that it has for decades. What is your community's commitment to intervening? What are your leaders doing to say, even though our past practices aren't able to go forward right now, what can we do? Advocacy services, as we have known for decades, are so critical, particularly in times of the less access to police and court. So we'll hear from advocates today about how important that is. The availability of safe shelter, the removal of the perpetrator from the home. Certainly, we're going to be doing these things completely differently than we have in the past, but in some ways they must proceed, and we all need to be just extremely creative in adapting those strategies. And Scott, we talked about this a little bit when we were preparing for the webinar a couple days ago. Do you have things to add there from your perspective?
Well, I think just as a general opening statement, the importance of this ongoing coordinating work in our communities, the partnerships that we create, the policies and protocols that we develop to respond to the crime when we're not in a crisis, really benefit when all of a sudden we are hit with a pandemic and have to scramble in order to get things in place when everybody's jobs all of a sudden move from offices to homes. There's data practice issues that all of a sudden become, paramount to figure out. How does a prosecutor get into a protected file in a government agency from a home base? The licenses had to be dished out. But what we didn't have to worry about here is the commitment to respond to this particular crime. That was a given. It was just figuring out how we were going to do that. If we had to try to convince people that that the response that we create needed to include domestic violence victims and dealing with the offenders, we probably would have never moved an inch. That was just already in place. So then what we're figuring out is what's the strategy going to be? How are we going to get documents pushed through the system? How are police going to get arrested? Are these individuals going to go to a jail when jails are releasing some folks? Who's going to stay? Who's going to, like, all that? We didn't have to argue it. It was already in place. So that was just as an opening kind of statement about the importance of ongoing organizing in your community. When these things happen, it really sets you in a much better position to respond than if you had to create it all from scratch.
Yeah, that is just a wonderful point, Scott. I really appreciate the organization, the communication between the frontline responders and the prosecutors and the advocates and the police. That can still happen. We can still strategize online and by phone and share information. And that was one of the game changers, 25 years ago, when we understood that kind of communication was what was going to make our laws meaningful for victims of violence. And we did that, and we can do that again. And that's the spirit in which we gather here today, we won't have all the answers today, but if we are working together and sharing where the gaps are and where we're seeing best practices, then we will be doing better. I hope that many of you have seen some of the just publications about how COVID-19 certainly carries so much additional harm for women. And not only are they locked in their homes with dangerous abusers in a way that is just increased, but their domestic burden has increased. Many are more financially precarious, and the isolation is just compounding that. We do have some statistics from locally and from around the states. Please do, by the way, I'm just going to interrupt myself here. If you are from another country, please do let us know that in the chat box. In the United States, we already have statistics from the National Domestic Violence Hotline that calls have increased, and victims have reported that abusers are using COVID-19 not only as or in the context of just being further isolated, but also as a scare tactic. When you think about the power and control wheel, there is another one there. We know, back to statistics here, I'm sure others are getting some from their states too, or communities. In Minnesota, our governor, thanks to our governor, Tim Walz, for announcing that, making clear that during the first week of our stay-at-home order here in Minnesota, 2/3 of our police calls were domestic violence calls. So even those kinds of things to be encouraging your leaders to do, that building awareness of how this COVID crisis is affecting our survivors and victims, so that this new world can be acted on and violence against women can be prioritized is so important. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Hillary. Welcome from the UK. I see her on there. Anything else to add to that, Scott? I'm going to go on to the next slide and just talk about quickly. Protective orders is going to. Okay, Scott. Sorry.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So our next slide, we are going to focus this particular webinar on protective orders. The title of the webinar is Court Response, and we could all sit here, I think, for a week and talk about all the different ways that courts are going to need to adapt to this crisis during the time that it goes on, and evolve as things change. Protective orders, I think many will agree with me that they have proven to be a very effective remedy for domestic violence victims in quote unquote normal times. We believe they will continue to be an essential part of a court's and legal system in general's intervention in domestic violence cases at this time. So those are going to be the focus of our discussion today. Now, you know, in the United States, certainly these can include court orders, immediate orders from law enforcement. In other countries, these are called barring orders. Emergency orders are available here in the United States and enforced by our sheriffs and police, and can include all of these bullet points here. No acts or threats of violence, no contact, barring perpetrators from the home, custody and parenting time, or child or spousal support. So these still are available remedies. These are in our laws, and it's going to be the courts and the advocates' challenge to figure out how to get these remedies adapted and in place during times when somebody doesn't have an income, neither party has an income, when there may be continuing brutal violence in the home, and there's no advocate to help a woman seek an order. So all of these remedies are there, and our challenge is to adapt in how to get them to women. So that's going to be our focus today. We could go to the next slide there. So I think we skipped a slide there, Melissa. Okay, here we go. We do have some international participants on now, so I'm challenging all of you to think about context. And when we're talking about, for example, a long-term order for protection that's issued after an evidentiary hearing, for example, maybe the jurisdiction that you come from that isn't relevant to you, or an emergency order that can stay in place for if the respondent doesn't ask for a hearing isn't something that happens in your jurisdiction. But listen and be thinking as our speakers talk about, to back up kind of and be thinking about how maybe there is a policy that you're hearing about that might not have been available in quote unquote normal times, but might be now, and you might be even able to adapt some policy or procedure or practice based on what you're hearing people are doing during this COVID crisis. For those of you in the US, just a general statement, there are so many different kinds of protective orders around the world. Some of the emergency orders, for example, can only stay in place for 24 hours or a couple days. In the United States, as I said, those orders can stay in place much longer if they're not challenged, and that might be something people can really be focusing on, is how are we going to get these emergency orders staying in place so they actually don't increase danger to women rather than keep them safer. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. The assistance to victims. Again, this varies around the world. If the police do have the authority to issue the emergency order right there on the scene, certainly that's going to be a huge advantage here during these times of the COVID crisis. If there are service centers in place, there may be policy orders that allow one-on-one at least meetings in those service centers where they may not be open for the entire public, but that advocates can use those forums to continue to help victims seek the orders. And then, of course, we're going to hope that to the extent criminal cases are going to be continued to be heard quickly in person and in hearings, that those protective orders, we call them DANCOs here, domestic abuse no contact orders, that courts will continue to prioritize those as much as possible. We're going to go to our panelists now on the next slide, and I'm going to ask first Lori to talk a little bit just generally about how your work has shifted and changed in the courts because of the COVID-19 crisis. Lori, can you hear me and go ahead?
Yes, thank you. And so the way that the work has shifted in my jurisdiction is that the courthouse remains open, but the courtrooms are all being conducted virtually. And so we are not having any in-person hearings at all right now in Itasca County. They're all conducted via participants calling in via phone or through video conferencing, as we're doing here right now.
Okay.
And I would just reiterate as to some of the things that Scott was indicating, when you have the policies in place, the way that we are conducting our work is different, but the nuts and bolts or the essence of how we do our work is the same. For example, when we have a domestic violence hearing, a criminal hearing, we would always have the input of the victim through an advocate or the victim herself if she wanted to participate. So that is still happening. We're making sure that if there's an advocate, that she is allowed or he or she is allowed to participate, and we're looking for that individual to participate in court. It's just that they're not doing that in person.
Are you having trouble, Lori? Are you finding that the less availability with advocates?
We are, and we've had that issue prior to the COVID-19 pandemic crisis in our community, that we are seeing a reduction in the funding available for advocates, and therefore that programming and availability for victims, we've seen a decrease as well.
Okay. Natia, have you joined us yet? I wanted to ask you that same question if you're there.
Sure, this is Melissa. She is not connect. She's having a connection problem. So
Okay.
Just know that.
All right, that's fine. How about Erin? Are you able to hear us now, Erin?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Wonderful. Welcome back. Why don't you introduce yourself and describe your work at the Domestic Abuse Service Center here and how it's shifted and changed.
Yes, so I am a staff attorney at Central Minnesota Legal Services. We are a civil legal aid organization here in Minneapolis, and we serve Hennepin County, where Minneapolis is, and Anoka County, which is just north of Minneapolis and slightly more rural county. At the Domestic Abuse Service Center, we do have a collaboration with the Service Center. So they are housed at the Hennepin County Government Center, and they provide on-site advocacy resources. They have a number of advocates from community organizations throughout Hennepin County who work on site to help petitioners file orders for protection. And then they also have detectives and prosecutors on site. And then last year, through our collaboration, we added civil legal services. So I take referrals from advocates to represent people in not just orders for protection, but then their subsequent civil legal needs. Most victims' legal needs don't end with an order for protection. There's often a need for housing help, representation and eviction, family law matters, public benefits issues. So our goal is to provide holistic services at the center. The way that our work has shifted has been, there's more of a disconnect, and it has been a challenge in making sure that survivors can access our services that they know we are open and we are still taking cases and we are available to them. So the advocacy work has shifted to be more remote, but our courts are still having hearings in person on some forms of relief. So they are scheduling hearings if there is a safety concern that is paramount or if a hearing is required for that safety concern. So the removal of a firearm requires the court to have a hearing. Determining emergency custody issues requires a hearing. So those hearings are happening in person. Other forms of relief, such as restitution, if someone is seeking reimbursement for property damage that resulted from the abuse, those issues are being reserved. And so the victims are able to get their emergency order and they can come back later to still get that restitution, hopefully at a time when we're all able to be in the same room. So they are trying to grant emergency orders without requiring people to come to court and then limiting the hearings they're holding for safety concerns. Our advocates are working remotely, and we are working remotely, but we are willing to attend court hearings. We've been assessing cases for lethality and trying to prioritize taking cases for representation where there are complicated legal needs or high lethality issues.
Erin, this is Melissa. There's a question in the chat box, which I think is relevant now. And the question is, how are you dealing with having abusers removed from the home when there's a stay-at-home order in your state?
So victims can still seek to have an abuser removed from the home, and the courts are granting that request. I will say I have seen some orders come through where our orders for protection also protect roommates. Roommates are covered under our statute, and I have seen, I think, a little more skepticism towards those cases because I think they're being viewed as a workaround for, we have a moratorium on evictions right now. So there's a little more skepticism towards the roommate cases that I've seen, and I think it's because they want to make sure it's not an attempt to avoid the fact that you can't file an eviction right now.
Thank you for that, Erin. And this is a great actually segue into our next slide. And we'll be, I think you're going to all have lots more questions about that. I'm going to ask you, John, as the referee who presides over so many of the order for protection hearings in Duluth. Erin was talking about prioritizing the certain cases, and will you just follow up on that, and how has that happened? I know that there's been a Supreme Court order issued. Is that directing your practice?
Absolutely, it's directing almost everything we try to do. The Supreme Court has, because obviously court operations are severely curtailed right now. I have a real nice chambers at the courthouse. As you can probably see, I'm not in it. I'm in my living room because any day that I'm not presiding over court, our directive is to work from home whenever we possibly can. But orders for protection under the Domestic Abuse Act are one of the case types that are still being heard. And our practice here is very similar to what was described by Erin insofar as cases where parties are at the same address, where there are immediate custody issues, where there are firearm issues, where that's a potential issue. We are hearing those cases. We're hearing them in person. We're taking some precautions that we wouldn't have taken before. First of all, we are being more permissive about remote appearances, requests to appear by telephone, by video conferencing. We're allowing that to a much greater extent than we would have previously. We're using a bigger courtroom than we used to use to spread out people more. Generally, my hearings were in a very kind of small hearing room where we're all kind of packed in. Now we're up in one of our big jury courtrooms where everybody can spread out. The courtroom or the courthouse is actually closed to the public in St. Louis County in Duluth so that the people who are going to be at the hearing are on a list, and it's going to be the parties, their attorney if they're represented. We are allowing victims to have one advocate appear with them and probably about one support person for each side. So the days when a party would come in with 10 or 15 people into the courtroom, which does happen, right now that's not something that we're allowing. These are public proceedings, but again, all of this is balancing public safety with the rights of parties to these actions and making sure that those are protected. We're wiping down everything, the counsel table and stuff between hearings. We're taking every precaution we possibly can to keep everybody safe, but it's a new world out there and things are changing very quickly. But the bottom line is that OFP filings, they're electronic. The window where people would come and file them in person is closed right now, although an increasing number of those filings have been electronic for a long time because the state court system has a very nice self-help website, and our advocates do a great job of helping people prepare their petitions, which is the document that lays out the allegation of abuse supporting the hearing. And we are holding those hearings as quickly as we can whenever it is appropriate to do so, which admittedly is in fewer cases than it was before.
Great, thank you, John. Scott, will you also answer that question too? How has the court process for protection orders changed during COVID-19? What's shifted in your practice? Anything you'd like to add to what John has described?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that as both advocates who work with individual women and advocates like myself who work on system change efforts, our access to the courtroom was daily. We were always in there for one hearing or another, observing, meeting with people, organizing something that we found as a gap that we've heard from victims. And I mean, there's just a lot of time that we spend in the courthouse meeting with judges, probation agents, other advocates, law enforcement, court security, like all those different agencies we had weekly connections with. And now those things have to be done virtually. So we're spending a lot more time on the phone. We can't show up at the courthouse unless there's a reason, as John was talking about. So if I'm not on a list, I'm not getting in for a particular hearing. So it slowed a lot of the organizing efforts, and we're having to find new ways of doing it. So yesterday we had all of our domestic violence probation agents who are housed in the courthouse on a meeting, go-to meeting like this, talking about how are we going to support victims and deal with offenders, given the fact that, for example, if you can't come to the courthouse, right, you can't do UAs. So these tests that they would do to see if the individual is not drinking, which is what our court orders say when there's a domestic violence conviction, or not using, can't be done. They know that now. So what probation officers are seeing is an increase in offenders using alcohol or drugs, which then significantly increases the risk to victims. So how do we figure that piece out when that courthouse is closed? Is an ongoing conversation, which I'll be having today with more people about how to solve that particular issue, because we're not violating. There's another thing, our probation department, I know not everybody around the world has probation as an agency, but it's a supervisory agency within corrections. They make sure that the sentence of the court is being followed by the offender, and their leverage is their ability to go into the field and check on these guys or have these guys weekly report. And when that can't happen, there's a great disconnect. Another interesting thing that I've learned, we have a lot of conversations about working with men who batter folks around the country. And, there's a lot of conversations about how the guys say things are going okay, like things are working well, until you start talking to advocates, until you start talking to probation agents who are hearing very different stories. So it's okay for the guy, how he's ever organized his house and his duties. But the impact, as you said, Cheryl, earlier, on victims is a lot more significant. And again, because we don't have that kind of ongoing contact with them, either in a group setting or in probation in the courthouse, it's a lot more difficult to figure out how to keep folks safe and keep men on a change process after conviction.
Yes. Thank you so much for that, Scott. So helpful. There has been some practices we've learned about where probation officers are actually going to the home and checking in with perpetrators personally and by phone. John, do you have anything to add to this whole conversation about probation, or Erin, Lori?
No, I don't think so. I generally deal with more the civil order for protection side of things, so I don't have a lot of direct communication with probation, but I think Scott's points are all very well taken.
Right. Lori, anything to add there?
Yes, and I see that in one of the comments that I believe the state of Pennsylvania, that parole and probation officers are actually being furloughed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. I can tell you that in Minnesota that probation is, the agents are working from home. I know that the probation agents are conducting more phone interviews. They're conducting the pre-sentence investigation reports by phone. They are having the perpetrators call in more on a daily basis so that they can check in with them. And I know that our office, our local office, that the probation agents are taking turns in going into the office if they need to receive documentation. What I don't know is their process for conducting UAs or other type of testing. I'm not certain as to how they're doing that, but I do know that some of the agents, they have a rotation schedule as to how they go in to the probation office, and then they have a procedure where they're wiping down the office when they leave. They're in there in 2-hour shifts, and then the next agent can come in and have use of the office.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So thank you, Lori. That's really helpful. For those of our international colleagues who are joining us, just briefly, the way, of course, that this ties in to our discussion is the just huge importance of having the order for protection, the breach, the violation of an order for protection be a crime. I know some countries have not had their laws articulate that explicitly. So that's where we're getting into this discussion. The orders for protection, their primary importance, and right now equally as important, always be enforced. The law state that that's be enforced. That's why we get the police and probation involved here in the courts. Scott, along we really can't separate completely civil orders for protection from the criminal. So much of our domestic activity in the courts are about orders for protection. Scott, would you kind of follow up on that and talk about prioritization of arrests and how important that is at this time? Arrests and
So our police chief put out a statement at the beginning of our governor's stay-at-home order that said how police will conduct themselves going forward, given this governor's order. And one of the things that the only crime he called out that is an example of what they would be addressing is domestic violence. So right now, if it's a domestic assault in Duluth, it's really business as usual. They're going to get arrested. They're going to get put in custody. They're going to get arraigned. How that happens might be different than how it's happened before, but that's what's going to happen. And then if they have to be held over because it's a more serious crime, like a felony, a higher level charge, then they're going to sit. And so what they've done to accommodate the spacing issues in the jail is release some low-level offenders that were sitting, like for example, property crimes. Those folks would be left. Low-level drug crimes would be released to create more spacing in the jail, so that the individuals that are sitting are ones that are have committed a crime against a person. So, yeah, I mean, just as an example, as soon as offenders figured out that there's no way for their probation officer to check their compliance to alcohol and drugs, it goes up, right? And so if they knew that if law enforcement said, we're not going to respond to domestic assault cases, or we're not going to arrest or incarcerate, I know exactly what would happen is in the same way, right? Yeah. So when we talk to offenders, we know that the coordinated response that we've created in Duluth affects their decisions to commit acts of violence. They tell us that. They tell us that because they don't want probation in their lives. They don't want paying bail bonds to get out of jail. They don't want law enforcement. They don't want somebody telling them what to do. And that's what's going to happen if they commit a domestic and get pulled into our system. So that overall coordinated response creates a particular narrative in a community when those offenders know that there's no room for this. Now, the minute they find a gap, they're going to start walking through it. And then we have to start rallying to figure out how, like in this chemical dependency issue, how are we going to rally around this one and solve that particular problem? Because the court deemed it as a technical violation, which they are not going to hear at this point. So that means that that means that victims are going to be a lot more at risk because of the use of these guys that they're living with. So that's exactly what we solved.
And Scott, I wanted to just provide a real quick hypothetical example of how seriously that's being taken. I have a colleague, another judge in the building, who was presented with a request for somebody to leave the jail a little early because of this. And it was 4 days on a fairly lengthy sentence, either a 60 or 90-day sentence on a domestic. And because they were unable to reach the victim to kind of run it by them, that request was denied. 4 days. And they said no, because the victim knows that this is the end date of that sentence and that's what their expectation is, and they were unable to reach and let that person know or kind of run it by them. And so that judge denied the request to release that person 4 days early. So these cases are very much prioritized here, and it's a good thing.
But that, I just want to follow up that narrative that you talk about. The police chief, for example, the leaders in the community making very clear in any way they can, whether it's the media or social media, that directly communicating to offenders or potential offenders, sexual assault and domestic violence are going to be prioritized in this community, creates, like you say, Scott, a narrative kind of environment. The message is just accountability will proceed. One quick, I see that Natia has been able to join us. That's wonderful. We'll bring her in here in a minute. One quick follow-up question to Scott, and that is, could you talk quickly about the importance of enforcement of orders for protection by police? Specifically, I'm not sure you addressed it, or if I missed it, sorry. just yeah, we're a little bit more general.
You're breaking up a little bit, but I think you're talking about the importance of enforcing orders for protection.
Police.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, in Minnesota, it is it's a crime to violate a no contact order for protection, and it's an enhanceable. That doesn't mean that all enforcement around the United States enforce those, but in our jurisdiction, that is something that law enforcement takes it as seriously as any other domestic. And the reason that part of the way that you have, when you're talking to law enforcement, for example, and you're asking them to do something like enforce a protection order, in a way that other people order. So you do the work to create the policy and the protocol about how to do that. But then you have advocates and law enforcement command reviewing the reports, reviewing the call to make sure that the patrol officers are executing it the way it was designed. And if you don't have a way to supervise compliance to whatever it is that you organize, then it's likely that those things are going to start slipping. So, so when we in Duluth, it starts with the state law that says that it's planned. Then what we do is we organize law enforcement in a way to follow up on a particular crime, and then we supervise to make sure that the way we designed it is the way that it actually gets executed. And that three-legged stool is a way to sustainably keep a response going in the community, that the offenders know, if I call her, if I show up, if I send a gift, I'm not going to talk my way out of it. It's going to be something I'm going to be held accountable to. So what we know through research and practice is that this population of offenders responds very well to consequences. And if the consequences are real and they're consistent, they hear them. When they think that there's a gap between them, when they think that they're not going to be held to account, they will absolutely take advantage of that space. So.
Okay. So, Cheryl, I believe that Natia is on from the Republic of Georgia. Natia, are you on? Can you put your webcam back on?
While she's doing that, I'm just going to say, please, all speakers, we're having a little bit of sound issue. Even our speakers, please mute yourself if you're not talking. We're going to try to see if we can. Everybody make sure they're muted if you're not talking. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Natia, are you on? We saw Natia for just a moment from the Republic of Georgia. And so we just want to, I'll put myself up here so she can see me. Natia, are you on? So for those of you who know, Natia is from the Republic of Georgia in Eastern Europe, and a prosecutor, and has worked hard there. She's now the Deputy Prosecutor General for the Republic of Georgia. And so why don't we just move on, Cheryl, and then I'll see if I can get her reconnected in the meantime, okay?
Yeah, I'll follow up on one thing Scott said again, and please, Erin and John, Lori, jump in here too if you have things to add. But it strikes me that, to the extent that the community can stay focused on ensuring that there are consequences, and if those consequences for violence have to be adapted in some way, that there's really a conversation about how that message can continue to be sent. Just such an important point. We talked yesterday in our webinar about batters intervention programs and how there's such a need in Europe to be adapting batters intervention programs to really be prioritizing victim safety because of when just all the really different dynamics when two people are in lockdown at home that have experienced violence in the past. There's just a whole rethinking that has to happen about sending the message of accountability, really challenging an abuser on behavior change, and how that has to be rethought in a crisis management situation, essentially is what they are in Italy, way ahead of where many of us are in the US. But at the same time, being able to figure out how do you speak with an abuser in a way that doesn't escalate the possibility of violence, doesn't escalate his feelings, and yet still does send that message of accountability and consequences as you described, Scott. And we're going to be digging into that on another webinar coming up because we had so many questions yesterday about how exactly, what are the conversations, our European colleagues, what are the words they're using, how are they doing this to make sure they maintain contact with abusers in a way that doesn't increase danger to victims, but also, doesn't collude with people who are using violence. Natia.
Natia, are you there? Oh, Cheryl, we lost her now.
Oh, shoot. Every time we get Natia back.
Yeah, Natia, can you hear us? So I think her microphone's on. Natia, can you hear us? Yeah, okay. So the next time Natia comes on, we'll just, whoever's talking will just stop so that we can get her. And that's okay. No, it was important, but we had her for a second and we don't hear her now. So, okay, there is a question in the comment box, and Erin, I'm wondering maybe if this one is for you, which is, does VAWA apply to people with FHPAP subsidies in Minnesota? Now, I don't know what FHPAP is. I'm hoping you do, Erin. So if you could talk about that, that'd be great.
VAWA does apply to most federal housing subsidies, with some of the project-based subsidies, so not the Section 8 housing choice vouchers. There are a few that VAWA does not apply. I'd have to check. I do have a list of what it applies to, but I can follow up on that question if maybe after the presentation I can check and get an email and send a response.
Great. Thanks, Erin.
Love those questions. We really will appreciate the opportunity to follow up on that. So thank you.
Oh, there's Natia. Natia's back. Natia, can you hear us? Now we can see you, but I don't know that if we can hear you. Natia, can you hear us at all? Oh, she's talking, but we can't hear her. Yeah, so Natia, you just keep talking and trying, and then as soon as we can hear you, we will let you talk. Okay? So one thing, Scott, I just want to say is that because there was some background noise a little bit, there have been some comments in the comment box about when you were talking about when Cheryl asked you about the importance of orders for protection being enforced. Could you just say a little bit about that?
Just to reiterate what I said. That would require me to remember what I said. So that. Offenders. One of the things we know from research, one of the things we know from practice, is that offenders are very responsive to consequences that are meaningful, right? So if it's a meaningful consequence to them, then it has influence on their decision to commit an act of violence. So in our community, in the state law says that a violation of a protective order is a crime. But that doesn't mean that law enforcement are going to enforce it on a consistent basis. So that's where we work together with our law enforcement partners in command to develop a policy and protocol so that it drives the officer on the street. If there's a violation, this is what you're going to do, and then the protocol is going to tell them this is how you do it. This is the evidence that you're going to need to collect to ensure that the prosecutor, when they get the case, can prosecute that case. One of the interesting things about the gaps that gets created is that law enforcement gather information in Minnesota and in most of the United States to what we call a probable cause, which is a very low burden of proof. If they collect evidence to that standard of proof, it makes it difficult for a prosecutor whose proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, 100%. So we have to build in ways in the protocol that they collect evidence at the scene so that they're really collecting evidence and writing a report that's beyond a reasonable doubt standard of proof as opposed to probable cause, which means our police reports can be 8 to 20 pages long on a violation of an order. So there's a lot of information that they're collecting at that scene. And when they do that, it makes it easier to hold that individual accountable, which means the narrative in the if you violate the protection, then you're going to be held responsible. There's not a gap there. There's not something that defenders think they can flip because what the community is saying is, by its consistent response to this particular crime, is that there's no room for it. And when you have that, you can impact recidivism with these individuals.
Okay, thanks, Scott. I just want to say that, so Natia, we're having a challenge connecting with you here today. So we are having another one of these next week. I was really hoping to have you on, but we're having a little bit of a technical problem. And, you know, there's lots of technical problems here at this point. For some of you who don't know, my internet completely shut down during this whole thing as soon as my children logged on to school. So, you know, this is the new world. We have a bunch of people on the internet. So thank you for being patient with us here at this time. But Cheryl, I think it's easier at this point because people are logging off and on if we not go to the slide, but what the next slide says is for people to talk about sort of a little bit, it says, what are sort of, do you know about the known challenges and the effects of this, right? Either positive or negative, right? So if you had the luxury of planning for this, which none of us did, so we're not here, you know, to blame anyone, but if you had the luxury of going back and think, boy, if we could have planned for this, we would have done this, what might that have been? Or what are some of the positive effects of this? Lori, you mentioned that a little bit initially about some of the positive effects. Do you want to maybe start with that?
Yes, one of the positive effects, I know that previously in orders for protection hearings, evidentiary hearings, and there's always been a request from victims who've often requested that they be allowed to testify by phone or by video because they were, you know, very afraid to be within the courthouse, to be within the same building, and certainly as John indicated, sometimes in a very small courtroom in very close proximity to the offender. And so now that there has been more of an acceptance of being able to participate in these hearings by telephone, by video conferencing, the effect that it has upon victims, they feel more relaxed and they feel more able to participate in a way without having that immediate presence be one other way that that they are feeling the power and the control and the dominance of the offender on them. But then on the flip side, you don't have that immediate ability to, as a practitioner, I do a lot of preparation with my clients prior to hearing. And so if there are victims who are coming to court without the assistance of an advocate, without the assistance of an attorney, and now you have one more disconnect in that they're appearing by telephone or they're appearing by video conference, I think that it makes it even more difficult. So you have a little bit of both going on right now.
Yeah, and John, I know you had some thoughts about this when we prepared for this, about credibility and being able to read people sort of in person. John, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Sure, and I certainly can appreciate where Lori is coming from, and I think, you know, we have a lot of protocols in place. I know Erin talked about in Hennepin County, even the separate waiting rooms for petitioners and respondents, meaning the victim and the alleged perpetrator. We stagger departures. We have security right in the courtroom. I've had many hearings where if a respondent, I think their eyes are, they're kind of trying to glare at the petitioner rather than looking up at me, I will say, hey, no, eyes forward. We do a lot of things to try to make coming to court as comfortable an experience as possible, understanding inherently it's not a comfortable experience. But as somebody who is a finder of fact and who has to make these decisions and in some ways look out for the due process rights of both sides as the judicial officer, there is no substitute for being able to assess tone of voice, body language, making those kind of credibility determinations. And I will tell you electronically, it is much, much more difficult to do. We're doing the best we can. I'll give a real quick hypothetical example. There was a case up in Virginia, Minnesota, about an hour north of Duluth yesterday, where a judge had conducted a hearing electronically, took some testimony. There was a question about supervised parenting time because the visitation center they had been using was closed. She issued some kind of order, involving a mutual acquaintance or something to try to work around that problem. Thought everybody had understood exactly what she was ordering, and the next day a party filed a motion to modify her decision because she claimed she couldn't really hear, and what she thought she had heard was not what she heard. We're all becoming more tech savvy because of this and doing the very best we can, but having everybody right in the courtroom where there's no ambiguity really does make things easier and make a difference. And hopefully someday we'll be back to that.
Yeah.
I think Erin, too, as a person assisting women in getting the applications for orders of protection filed, you had some thoughts about that, too, how the in-person advocacy is challenging for victims and for you. Do you have anything further to say about that, Erin?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that we are seeing right now is being able to access our services. So we know that people are staying at home, and we know they're more isolated, and we've heard reports that there is an increase in police calls, but we are not seeing that same increase in people reaching out to us for advocacy support and then referrals to legal services. So that's my main concern right now, is that we know that there's this increase, but there's a disconnect in being able to contact us, and that may be because you don't have a safe place in your home to call and be able to talk to an advocate. You can't safely use the internet to find out where you can go, or you know that maybe the police are still responding to calls, but you don't know that advocacy services are open. And that in-person contact is so important, because you're not just giving information, you're also a source of support, and you're really trying to build trust and connect with the person that you're working with. And so we have been trying to increase our use of technology, try to use video calls to have face-to-face contact. But most of my clients are of limited means and don't necessarily have all the technology to be able to do that. So that is my main concern, and I do think that we may not know the true effects of this until later. It may take some time, and as an organization, we are focusing on reaching out to our partners, making sure they know we're open, what are they seeing, what are their needs, and really trying to be collaborative and innovative in this moment, because we have to be.
Right, exactly. The disconnect that you described there is something that we have heard, Erin, over and over again. This the increased danger, the increased calls to police, and yet the decrease in what is actually ending up in our court systems, in our our service centers. So that is our challenge. Is we know that these incidences, this is a more dangerous time. We've got statistics now that incidences are going up, and yet we're not seeing these cases in our legal systems, even at the level that we used to.
Yeah. So John and Scott and Lori, can you say where are your numbers for civil protection order filings? And we're curious from people, others, to say that in the chat box. Tell us about, have you noticed a decrease or increase?
And I can start there. Obviously, we're very new to this. We're about 2.5 weeks into the number of OFP filings are noticeably down. And we certainly don't believe that's because the instances of abuse are down, for all the reasons that we're discussing. I think there is so much of people sort of adjusting to this new reality and just trying to withstand what for many people is an economic crisis, a loss of income. All of a sudden, kids aren't in school. I mean, people's worlds have been completely turned upside down in ways that were incomprehensible even a month ago. And Cheryl, I don't mean to steal your thunder as moderator here, but I know in our meeting, Scott had made a wonderful point about children not having contact with other people who would otherwise be mandated reporters, you know, extra sets of eyes and ears on the ground. Scott, do you want to talk a little more about that point that you had made? Because I thought it was an excellent one.
Yeah, so in Minnesota, we have a law called, it's a mandatory report law where people who have care of children in their professional capacity are required to report any disclosures of abuse that the children might communicate, or any bruising that they see in children. And because children are now at home, they're not having FaceTime with all these different people that typically were the mandatory reporters to our Department of Human Services. So those reports are down. And if you think about, Melissa's question, what's one of the major tactics of an abuser? It's to isolate his victim. In a way, this pandemic has given, it made it a lot easier for offenders to isolate victims and keep them from communicating with the sources of information and resources to get out that they would normally have, because he's always there. And we're hearing it from probation, that offenders, when they call them, they're just talking away, not a problem. But when they talk to victims, they're getting very limited kinds of conversations because they can't talk because he's there. And so, in our men's program, when the guys were in the group, then that's when the advocate would typically call victims, because we know where he is. We know he's in a program, so now let's have a conversation with her. We can't do that anymore because they're together, and the kids are too. So yeah, I think we really, not that we would have seen this coming, but, and as Erin said, we're going to learn a lot when this is over. But we really got caught, I think, unprepared for a catastrophe like this in relation to protecting victims. We're doing everything we can, obviously, but I think we're woefully unprepared for rallying around what victims need right now.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you so much, Scott. I'm thinking that, let's see.
So Cheryl, one thing is, I'm just going to put this in the chat, and I've been looking at the chats, but we do have someone from the Women's Foundation of Minnesota who's on listening and wanted to share, and I'm going to put this in the chat box right now, that they've set up a special fund for those in Minnesota to assist with victims. And we're also aware that a number of foundations around the world are doing that, so we wanted to share that. We also wanted to share that there's some comments in here about some other things, that are happening, around the world in terms of this. One person had wrote that that there's a general concern that the enforcement of protective orders or enforcement of the law, that the police are being apprehensive because they're worried about introducing coronavirus to the jail, for example, and then worrying about what message that sends to women, and are women not even, I think one of the questions I had asked in our preparation meeting was, do women even know that they can get help? Right? Like, what are we doing as people who do this work to let them know we're still in business? I love the governor of Minnesota, but boy, was I disappointed when I saw the list of their advertisement, all the things that are still operating, that domestic and sexual violence programs was not one of the ones listed, right? Our coalition had to add that and revise that sort of image. So, part of what we want to know is, what do you all know, about this? One of the,
yeah. I'm sorry, Melissa.
Oh, no, that's what I was going to say. Is Barbara asks, are police going to the homes of battered women to do safety checks? She said, Austin, Texas has done so for years. It's controversial. Does it put victims in greater danger if the batterer is at the house when the police call? How do police avert increased danger when the batterer is living in the victim's home, other than telling the abuser that the safety visits, calls are routine and that the victim did not make the call to the police to come in? And then the other part about that is there too little police capacity to do that? So Scott, do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, yes, we organized something in Duluth with probation around a similar kind of strategy where probation was picking the top high-risk offenders every week and doing field visits with them. Now, they had heard somebody did this in another community and they wanted to do it here. We said, okay, well, we need to talk to women first in focus groups to find out, do they even want us to do that? And overwhelmingly, the women that we talked to in the different focus groups said, I don't think we had one woman say no. They all said, yes, we really want that to happen, but we want you to do it a particular way. Like, for example, when you come into our home, you take him out of our earshot. Don't talk to him about what you're going to talk to him about in front of the kids and I, right? They said, leave me out of the conversation. Do not talk to me. The minute you start talking to me, then I have to answer and it's going to be wrong. And I don't want to have that moment with him. So if you're coming to see him, then just see him. Don't talk to us. We can navigate the space, right? If you just leave us out of it. And then interestingly, we said, well, what about if he's not home? What about you've got this probation officer showing up? And if it's a male probation officer, is that going to be an issue? And they thought, no, they know his age, they know their officer, they're not going to have a problem with that. But they said, if you have developed a relationship with me prior to your visit so that I trust you, and trust meant you aren't going to sell me out to hold him accountable. We might be willing to show you where his stash is. And interestingly, I said to the focus groups, how many of your partners have a stash? In Minnesota, if you're convicted of a domestic assault, there is a no drink, no use policy for the duration of your probation. So they can't have any substances. And almost every single woman raised their hand. So that just shows you the level of non-compliance. But they said, we'd be willing to show you where it is in the house if we trusted that you wouldn't sell us out, right? And finding it. So we had all kinds of conversations about how probation goes into those homes and finds that contraband without it being something that they would have learned from her, right? So again, all these strategies are great, but you really need to talk to the people you're serving first to find out, should you do it? And then if yes, how do you do it so that you don't make it worse for her?
I was just going to emphasize that, Scott, thank you. At the beginning of any kind of exploration of legal reform that Global Rights for Women does with international partners or partners locally here, we have committed to these kinds of focus groups that Scott is talking about. And that is, the stakeholders certainly in any kind of reform, but first and foremost, talking with victims and survivors of violence, whether they're survivors of sexual violence or domestic violence. What would, the way you described it was so beautiful. What's happening? We have this idea. How do you think that would play out? And in these times in COVID, I'm so interested and hopeful that our advocacy community and primarily will be in constant communication with victims, finding out what's happening. What do you need? What can we possibly be doing differently or better? We thought this would be a great solution. Don't, check that out, like Scott has so beautifully described here, with any kind of reform, new law, new practice at any time, and certainly during this time of isolation and crisis, to be hearing from the experts on effective legal system intervention, and that is the victim survivors.
Yeah, I think that's one thing, Scott, that I think would be important is that, one of the things we've realized is that, you know, because this has been such a quick change and a quick reorganization, you know, people are trying to figure out what to do. And we know that people do have to make changes. At the same time, how would you recommend that people reach out to victims? Like, could you get feedback from victims, you know, at this point to find out about what you're doing? Are you doing phone calls? You obviously can't get women together in a group, because I think the challenge is that, you know, as we say, like, you know, we're all nice, kind, committed people here. We all have some ideas about what should be done differently, yet we're not going to think about some things that some women would inform us about when we're changing the court processes. So is there a way to do that, you know, at this time that you've done?
This is part of our woefully, I mean, we're just not prepared for this. So right now, the conversations we're having with victims are really about like crisis kinds of things. So our visitation center is calling victims who are doing exchanges. We don't have a visitation center open right now. We're trying to figure out a way to reopen it for exchanges. How would that happen, right? We have to get to the conversation about the bigger question about what should we have done. We're just not there. We're still scrambling to figure out what we should be doing on the ground right now. So yeah, we haven't even got to that layer yet.
So we have a question here about men's groups, and I'm seeing that our time is about to come to an end. Let me just say quickly in response to this question about men's groups, we have done a series of webinars on men's groups. It's a huge issue globally about whether we continue and how to continue them, and how to continue them without further endangering victims and survivors. So please go onto our website for all of you who would like more information about that. I wanted you to give John and Lori and Erin any thoughts that they want to add to what Scott and Melissa have said here.
And maybe just final thoughts from each of you, and then we'll see if there's any other questions, if we have any other time, but we want some final comments from you all.
I guess I can start. Just, you know, very broadly, everybody agrees that shelter in place and physical distancing and the kind of practices we're engaging are critical for community safety, but they have a very fundamental incompatibility with what we call best practices for the safety of victims of abuse. And that's the tightrope that we're all trying to walk, and why this is such an important topic, and one that we're going to need to come back to frequently because things are changing so quickly. And, you know, all we can do is the best we can. You know, I want to reiterate that the courts are open for these type of cases. They are being prioritized, and they are being heard, specifically, again, cases where there are issues that are pressing and need a quick hearing. We're going to get you that quick hearing. And if somebody is not comfortable coming to the courthouse, we're going to do our best to accommodate that as well.
And I would also reiterate what John has been talking about. I know that on the doorway of each of the entryways into our courthouse, there is a phone number for anyone who is coming to the court requesting an order for protection or a harassment restraining order, that they are to call the number, and that an official from court administration will meet them at the door and answer any question through the phone. They will provide them the paperwork so that they can, if they can't get on the website to fill out the forms and the petition for an order for protection, that they're able to get a packet right then and there so that they can do that. And that is an immediate response for victims. We're also seeing, again, as a result of that disconnect, for example, I represent an offender who is scheduled for sentencing this very coming Monday on an order for protection violation and the underlying domestic assault, and his sentencing hearing has been continued, and we don't know when that will even be. And so, granted, he still has all of the practices in place where he is being monitored by probation on the pretrial release program, but certainly that, you know, as John said, what's good for the community might not necessarily be good for the people who are most directly impacted when there's domestic violence in the home, and that's the victim, the children, and certainly the offender as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Erin, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, these cases have always been a priority for legal aid, and that has not changed during this pandemic. They will continue to be our priority. We've really been expanding the level of services that we're providing. So in the past, if there was a case where maybe I was not able to represent in person, or even now if there's not a hearing but people need help with motions, we have been prioritizing more extensive services beyond simply giving legal advice. So I have been following up with people repeatedly over the phone, helping them draft, getting things signed remotely, drafting motions. We're really trying to increase the amount of support that we're providing, since on some of these cases we cannot be there with them in person, and we are continuing to improve our resources so that as the courts sort out how we're going to be doing these remote hearings, we are able to be there remotely and continue to be a source of support.
Wonderful. Melissa, do you have any final thoughts?
No, just that there's just been a couple of questions here, and we will send answers to those questions in the chat box, and put those in part of our email response for the ones that we didn't get to. And then there's been some more questions about the men's group, and we'll include that too, because that's a different topic but related, and so we'll send you those as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you all, Melissa and all the panelists and all of you who joined us. It's so wonderful to be in solidarity with you right now as we continue this movement. Please know that we will be continuing our webinar series, and we are posting the new webinars up on our website. We're taking the questions that we get from these and adapting our content to them. We may be deciding to do ones that are more tailored for certain regions in the world versus here at home in the US. And I am very much looking forward to staying in community and solidarity with you on this issue. So we'll close now, and again, thank you